He had been in Greyward for 4 years. The photograph in the archive was 27 years old. It was the same face. Not similar. Not reminiscent. The same jaw. The same shoulders. The same right hand lower than the left. The same weight distribution. The same quality of stillness that a camera could not fully capture, but that Cael Drift had spent 11 months learning to read, and now recognized the way you recognized something that had been in front of you long before you understood what you were looking at. The same man. Unchanged. In a photograph taken before the researcher documenting him had been born, Cael Drift had been sitting across a breakfast table from this thing for 11 months. He had been measuring its temperature. He had been calling it a subject. If this is your first time here, welcome to Scar Howl Audiobooks. Hit subscribe and leave a like so you never miss what the forest keeps. Now stay with this. It gets darker. Greyward settlement sat at the northern edge of a boreal forest that had no southern equivalent and no eastern limit and no name in any record Cael had found that was older than the settlement itself. The forest simply was. Spruce and birch and the compressed permanent silence of old growth that had never been logged because nobody had ever wanted it badly enough to reach this far for it. It pressed against the settlement's northern boundary with the patience of something that understood it would outlast every structure ever built inside it and every person who had ever lived inside those structures. 38 residents. 24 structures. A supply road that ran 60 kilometers south to the nearest town and was passable in most conditions and impassable in the conditions that mattered. Cael arrived on a Tuesday in late October. The light was already failing by mid-afternoon. The forest to the north was a dark wall against a sky that had not been fully light in weeks. He set up his equipment in the converted storage room that served as his workspace, registered his presence with the settlement coordinator, a precise woman named Isolde Rav who answered his questions with the economy of someone who had answered them before, and attended his first communal dinner that evening with the particular alertness of a researcher in the first hours of a new placement. He was good at the work. 9 years. 5 placements. Remote northern settlements, each one smaller and more compressed than the last. Each one producing the same kind of data through the same kind of patience. The slow accumulation of behavioral baseline that only extreme proximity and extreme stillness could generate. He had a rule, developed after his second placement when the data had stopped being data and started being something he carried home with him. When the thread stops being professional, close the file. 8 years. 4 placements. The rule had held. He noticed Aldrich Fenn at the first communal dinner. Not with alarm. Not with the specific focused attention he would later bring to every documented interaction. Just noticed, the way a researcher noticed at a first communal meal, building the initial social map, cataloging the space. A man at the far end of the long table. Mid-40s in apparent age. Sitting with the particular stillness of someone who was not performing ease but actually had it. Not integrated into the conversation around him. Present alongside it. Absorbed rather than integrated. The distinction would take Cael several weeks to fully articulate, but he registered it that first evening as a quality he had not encountered before in 41 prior months of embedded community research. He noted the name from the community roster. He wrote it in his field log with a single annotation. Peripheral integration. Observe. He did not think about it again until the morning of day 3. The first number was 34.1. Resting core temperature. Aldrich Fenn. 0743, day 3. Measured with the calibrated field thermometer Cael had used across 4 prior placements without a single documented equipment inconsistency. Indoor environment. Ambient temperature 19 degrees. Subject seated, apparently rested, drinking coffee. 34.1 degrees Celsius. The resting core temperature of a body in the early stages of hypothermia. Not possible in an adult male in a 19-degree indoor environment without clinical intervention. Not possible in a man showing none of the behavioral indicators that a temperature of 34.1 produced. No shivering, no cognitive slowing, no postural compensation for cold. None of it. Just a man drinking coffee as though the morning was entirely ordinary. Cael wrote the number in his field log. He noted the ambient temperature and the measurement conditions and the equipment serial number. He noted that no behavioral indicators consistent with the reading had been observed. He noted that he would repeat the measurement under controlled conditions. He did not note what he was already thinking. He closed the log. He finished his breakfast. He attended the morning assembly. He did his work. The repeat measurement came on day 5. Settlement-wide baseline physiological assessment. Standard methodology. Temperature, blood pressure, resting heart rate, basic respiratory function from each resident. Isolde Rav approved it without question. Cael conducted it methodically across 3 days, working through the community roster in the order that easiest cooperation dictated. Eldrick Fen. Day 5. Afternoon. Indoor. 18 degrees ambient. Subject seated and rested for 10 minutes prior. Same thermometer. 3 readings at 2-minute intervals. 34.2, 34.1, 34.2. Cael recorded all 3. He noted the conditions and the equipment serial number. He noted the consistency with the day 3 measurement. He thanked the subject and moved to the next name on his roster. What he did not note was the way Aldrich Fenn had watched him record the numbers. Not with curiosity. Not with the ordinary human interest of a person being measured and wondering what the instrument showed. Just watching. With the ease of someone watching a process they had watched before. As though the numbers on the thermometer were not new information to him. As though he already knew what they would show. That evening Cael opened a new file on his laptop. He titled it AF Secondary Observation. He wrote the first entry. Repeat measurement confirms day 3 reading. Temperature 34.1 to 34.2 across 3 controlled readings. No equipment fault. No behavioral indicators of hypothermia. Subject's response to measurement process inconsistent with ordinary subject behavior. No curiosity, no reaction, no questions. He paused. Then he added one more line. As though he already knew what they would show. He looked at that sentence for a while. He left it in. The sleep data came from the settlement's own systems. Greyward had installed a passive environmental monitoring network 3 years prior. Motion sensors, temperature regulators, door and window contact logs. A remote community safety initiative. The data was available to Cael through his institutional access, and he had been pulling it since his first week for environmental baseline analysis. Aggregate data. Population level. On day 12 he began looking at individual data. He pulled the contact log for the exterior door of Aldrich Fenn's residential unit. 11 days of records. He laid them out in a table. He looked at the table for a long time without writing anything. The door had opened between 0200 and 0230 on 9 of the 11 nights. On 7 of those occasions it had not logged a close for between 14 and 23 minutes. On 2 occasions it had opened and closed within 40 seconds, as though whatever had gone outside had almost immediately returned. He pulled the exterior motion sensor data for the same periods. 8 of the 9 door openings. No sensor activation. A door opening. A person, presumably, going outside. And then nothing. No motion registered in the exterior common spaces. No activation across the full sensor network. Either the sensors were malfunctioning, or whatever went outside was not moving through the common spaces, or whatever went outside was not activating sensors calibrated for human-scale motion. He pulled the maintenance logs. No reported faults. Full calibration 3 months prior. All sensors green. He wrote in the private file. Door contact log inconsistent with motion sensor data across 8 of 11 nights. Subject exits unit between 0200 and 0230. No corresponding motion activation in exterior sensor network. Cannot account for this within standard framework. He stopped. Then he kept writing. Temperature data. Sleep pattern data. 2 data streams producing results that should not be possible for a human subject. Beginning systematic behavioral observation. The behavioral observation required the kind of patience that 9 years had built in him slowly, without drama, without shortcuts, through repetition and stillness and the deliberate suppression of the instinct to reach conclusions before the evidence was ready to support them. He restructured his morning workspace positioning. Better light from the east-facing window, technically accurate. Also giving him a direct sight line to Aldrich Fenn's habitual table position across every shared meal. He adjusted his movement patterns through the settlement. Not obviously. Not in any way that registered as surveillance. With the subtle consistency of a researcher who understood that his value to a study was in inverse proportion to how visible his methods were. He built a secondary observation log within the private file. He began filling it. Day 14. Communal breakfast. Subject arrived at 0731. He moved to his habitual position at the end of the long table, a position Cael had now documented him occupying at 41 of 43 shared meals. The position offered sight lines across the full room and a direct line to both exits. He did not choose it each time through social calculation or habit or the ordinary pull of comfort. He moved to it with the automaticity of something that had been making that choice for so long that the choice had become indistinguishable from instinct. Day 16. Evening assembly. The communal hall's heating system was running high. A regulation fault. 24 degrees ambient. Warm enough that several residents had removed outer layers. One had opened a window. Aldrich Fenn had not removed his outer layer. 90 minutes at 24 degrees ambient in a heavy wool sweater. No sleeve rolling. No collar loosening. No unconscious fanning or shifting for ventilation. 12 other residents documented making temperature-related behavioral adjustments during the same period. Aldrich Fenn, none. Day 19. Communal dinner. Cael had been documenting dietary selection across the full community as part of his legitimate research baseline. Aldrich Fenn's plate that evening contained almost exclusively protein. 2 servings of cured meat. Hard cheese. Preserved fish. No bread. No potato preparations. No carbohydrate-heavy dishes of any kind. Cael checked his prior dietary documentation. Across 41 communal meals, protein-dominant selection rate 91.3%. Carbohydrate-heavy selection, 3 occasions. In 11 months of observation across 4 prior placements, Cael had never documented a dietary selectivity profile this consistent in a human subject. Day 20. Communal assembly. A resident had brought a dog into the hall, a working border collie that had been part of the settlement for 3 years. Well socialized. It moved through the communal hall with the easy confidence of an animal that had been in this space hundreds of times and found it entirely familiar. It stopped when it reached the end of the long table. Cael documented this because he documented everything and because a dog stopping was observable behavior and observable behavior was data. The border collie stopped approximately 1 meter from where Aldrich Fenn was seated. It did not come closer. It did not growl. It did not display any of the postural indicators of threat response. No raised hackles, no lowered head, no weight shift toward flight. It simply stopped. Then it turned itself away from that end of the table and moved back toward the hall's entrance and sat down near the door and did not return to that end of the room for the remainder of the assembly. Cael checked his ambient documentation for prior instances of the dog's behavior in Aldrich Fenn's proximity. He found 7. On all 7 occasions the dog had not come within approximately 1 meter of him. On all 7 occasions Cael had logged it as ambient behavioral data and attributed it to the ordinary idiosyncrasies of animal preference. He added all 7 to the secondary observation log. Then he wrote one line beneath them. The dog has always known. I was not paying the right kind of attention. Day 21. Working late. 21:47. Footsteps in the corridor outside his workspace, the ordinary settlement sounds of residents returning to their units. He noted it without significance and kept working. At 22:03 the footsteps stopped outside his door. Not passing. Stopped. He did not move. He sat at his desk with his hands on the keyboard and he listened to the specific quality of someone standing on the other side of a closed door. Not knocking. Not moving away. Standing. He counted. 40 seconds. Then the footsteps moved away down the corridor with the same unhurried quietness that he had been documenting for 21 days. He could not confirm it was Aldrich Fenn. He documented it as an unconfirmed proximity event and he kept going. Day 31. Second settlement-wide assessment. Pretext, 3-month follow-up baseline. Aldrich Fenn's temperature, 34.1. Blood pressure, 108/62, the lower end of normal range. Consistent with prior measurement. Consistent with a cardiovascular system operating with an efficiency that resting human physiology did not typically achieve without sustained conditioning. Resting heart rate, 44 beats per minute. The resting heart rate of a highly conditioned endurance athlete. Aldrich Fenn's documented physical activity across 31 days of observation was moderate. Maintenance tasks. A perimeter trail walk 3 times weekly. No athletic training documented. A resting heart rate of 44 was not consistent with this activity level. Cael wrote it in the private file and kept going. Day 37 arrived the way days arrived in Greyward. Gradually, the light building by degrees from the permanent compressed gray of the boreal winter into the slightly less gray of actual morning, the distinction so subtle that after 11 months Cael had stopped registering it as a transition. He was in the communal hall at 0630, earlier than usual, reviewing his observational notes from the prior week. The only person in the hall. Aldrich Fenn came through the entrance at 0641. Unusual. His documented arrival time at communal meals was between 0728 and 0744 across 41 prior observations. 0641 was 47 minutes outside his established pattern. He was wearing the same clothes from the previous evening's dinner. His hair was damp. Not the damp of a recent shower but the specific flattened quality that prolonged cold air and extended time outside produced. Forest debris on his boots. Pine needles. Dark soil. The accumulated contact of forest floor rather than settlement paths. He had been outside. In the forest. Overnight. The temperature the previous night had been -17. He moved through the hall to the kitchen area with his habitual quietness and poured coffee and turned and found Cael watching him. No reaction. No surprise. No social adjustment. He looked at Cael with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, unhurried, carrying nothing, and said good morning in the voice of someone for whom the morning was entirely ordinary. He sat down 3 seats away with his coffee. Cael said good morning. He wrote nothing until Aldrich Fenn had left the hall 20 minutes later. Then he opened the private file. Day 37. Subject arrived at communal hall 0641 47 minutes outside established pattern. Physical indicators consistent with extended outdoor exposure and overnight conditions. Damp hair, forest debris on boots. Ambient overnight temperature, -17. No behavioral indicators of cold exposure. No shivering. No vascular response. No postural compensation. He stopped. Then he kept writing. Subject spent the night, or a significant portion of it, in the forest at -17 degrees and arrived at communal breakfast as though this were unremarkable. He pulled the door contact log for the prior night. Unit door opened at 23:18. Not logged as closing until 06:29. 6 hours and 11 minutes. Exterior motion sensors. No activation across that entire period. 6 hours in the forest at -17. No sensor activation on exit or return. He sat with that. He did not reach for the next thought immediately. He let the data exist in the space of professional observation for long enough to be certain he was not reaching. Then he wrote one more line. The distinction between moving through the sensor network without triggering it and moving in a way that the sensors cannot detect has stopped being a meaningful distinction. Both possibilities point in the same direction. I am done treating them as separate. The archival request was filed on day 41. Professionally legitimate. Standard methodology. Historical health records, prior community assessments, demographic documentation going back as far as Greyward's records reached. Isolde Rav provided access without question. He told himself he was looking for dietary pattern data across prior decades. He was looking for Aldrich Fenn. He found him on day 44. Folder 41. A community health assessment from 27 years prior. Group photographs from a summer documentation session. Poor image quality. The particular overexposure of a mid-range camera in flat northern light. He was scanning the image from left to right in the methodical way he did everything. He stopped somewhere in the middle. A figure at the right edge of the group. Standing with the weight even and the sight lines clear and the right hand lower than the left. Not looking at the camera. Looking at the exits. Cael put the photograph face down on the table. He sat in the document room and looked at the wall. The room was small. Yellow light. The smell of old paper. The settlement beyond the closed door was doing its ordinary afternoon things, completely uninformed about what he was sitting with. He breathed slowly. He counted 4 minutes by the clock on the wall. Then he picked the photograph back up. The jaw. The breadth of the shoulders. The postural asymmetry he had documented 47 times across 11 months of secondary observation. The specific quality of the stillness that a camera could not fully capture but that he now recognized immediately and without doubt. 27 years. The man in the photograph was not younger than the man he had been documenting. He was the same. Not similar. Not reminiscent. The same. He photographed the photograph. He logged the source. He wrote in the private file. Archival image 27 years prior. Same subject. No visible age difference from current documentation. Pursuing additional archival records. He stayed in the document room for 5 more hours. 2 more images. The first from a regional public health survey conducted 41 years prior. A different settlement, a community called Birchward, 300 kilometers southeast, dissolved decades ago. A group image from that community's final documented year. A figure at the edge. Partially turned. The same weight distribution. The same bilateral sightline positioning. The same jaw and the same shoulders and the same right hand lower than the left. The second from a community health bulletin 11 years ago. A landscape photograph of Greyward from elevation, included as contextual documentation. In the lower right corner, small, partially obscured by a building edge, a figure. Standing at the settlement's northern boundary. Facing the forest. 3 images. 41 years, 27 years, 11 years. 2 different settlements and then this one. The same figure in each. Unchanged across 4 decades. Cael built a timeline in the private file. For locations. Each one remote. Each one boreal forest adjacent. Each name ending at a clean edge when traced backward. Not a gap in the records but a beginning. A name that had started at a specific moment with no prehistory. No bureaucratic residue of a life lived before the point of documentary origin. School records absent. Address histories absent. Each name a surface without depth. Each surface professionally produced and completely convincing to anyone who was not specifically looking for the edge of it. He traced the gaps between locations. 2 to 4 years each, undocumented. He traced the length of residence at each location before departure. 4 to 7 years. Long enough to be absorbed. Not long enough to generate a documentary history that survived a backward trace. He looked at the timeline for a long time. Then he wrote the thing he had been building towards since day 3. 4 documented locations. Minimum 41 years. Possibly longer, archive access limited. Remote northern settlements, boreal forest adjacent, populations under 50. Names change at each location. Documentary prehistory for each name, none. The names are not identities. They are operational covers. Generated as needed. Maintained for the duration of a stay and abandoned when the duration becomes documentarily problematic. He paused. He breathed. He has been in Greyward for 4 years. I arrived 11 months ago. I have 1 month remaining in my assignment. He did not write what that meant. He did not need to. There was a researcher before him. He found her in the records on day 49. A behavioral health researcher assigned to Greyward 6 years prior. 12-month embedded study. Same institutional framework. Same research parameters. Same converted storage room workspace. Her name was Mira Sold. Her official field records for the first 8 months were clean and thorough. The documentation of a precise and experienced researcher conducting a legitimate study. The final 4 months were different. Different in a way that would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent 49 days living inside the same shift themselves. The behavioral notes on one specific community member, identified by demographic code only, not by name, but the demographic data matching Aldrich Fenn's profile precisely, became more granular than the study required. More frequent. More reaching. As though she was trying to find words for something that kept arriving at the edge of the vocabulary she was professionally permitted and stopping there because there was nowhere professional for the words to go. She had documented the temperature readings. He sat with that for a moment before he kept reading. Not because it surprised him. Because seeing his own data in another researcher's handwriting from 6 years prior produced a specific quality of stillness that he had not anticipated and that required acknowledgement before he could continue. She had documented the temperature readings and the sleep pattern anomalies and the cold tolerance and the dietary selectivity and the specific quality of room orientation that Cael had spent 49 days learning to read. She had gotten to the same place he had gotten. Entry by entry, measurement by measurement, the same thread, the same direction, the same accumulation of data that should not have been possible, producing the same picture he had been building in his own private file for 7 weeks. She had gotten further. He closed the document. He did not do this deliberately. He simply found that his hands had closed it and that he was looking at the desk surface instead of the screen and that some part of him needed a moment before he opened it again. He gave himself the moment. He counted it, 4 minutes by the clock on the wall. He breathed. He opened the document. In the final month of her official records there was a section written in a compressed hand. The handwriting of someone getting something down before the nerve for it failed. A description of a direct conversation with the subject. Approximately 30 minutes. The notes were detailed for the first 2/3. Then they became fragmented. Words rather than sentences. Impressions rather than observations. The record of someone whose professional framework had run out of language and was trying to continue without it. Then they stopped. Mid-phrase. No punctuation. As though the pen had been set down and not picked up again. He sat with the broken sentence for a long time. He looked at where the words ended and the white space began, and he thought about what a researcher sat across from for 30 minutes that produced a sentence that did not finish. He thought about it for long enough that the document room's yellow light seemed to flatten further, and the smell of the old folders became more present, and the settlement beyond the door felt further away than it had when he came in. The next entry was 9 days later. 4 words. Do not do that. He read them once. He set the document face down on the desk. He put both hands flat on the surface beside it and looked at his hands and breathed and did not pick it up again for a long time. 4 words. 9 days after a conversation that had broken off mid-sentence. Whatever Mira Sold had spent those 9 days sitting with before she arrived at those 4 words was not in the record. Was not anywhere in the record. Was in the white space between the broken sentence and the 4 words and nowhere else. He picked the document back up. The subsequent records were filed by a different researcher. A single administrative line noting the transition. No explanation given. No forwarding record for Mira Sold. No subsequent publications under that name. No new institutional affiliation. He traced her career backward through the databases he had access to. 11 years of professional output, publications, conference presentations, institutional affiliations, the steady accumulating record of a researcher who was good at her work and continuing to do it. He traced it forward from the point of her departure from Greyward. 8 months of nothing. And then the edge. Clean. Final. A career that had been producing output and then was not, and left no trace of where it went. Not a gap. A clean edge. The same kind of edge as the names. He wrote in the private file. Prior researcher Mira Sold. Professional record ends 8 months post-departure from Greyward. No subsequent trace. The ending has the same quality as the documentary edges of the subject's names. Not absence. Surface. Something that was there and then was not, cleanly, without residue. He stopped. He breathed. Then he added one more line. I am documenting this in case it becomes relevant to someone who reads this file after me and does not find me here to ask. He looked at that sentence. He did not delete it. He thought about 4 words written 9 days after a conversation that had broken off mid-sentence. He thought about the 3 options available to him: close the file and leave, keep the file and leave, or speak with Aldrich Fenn directly. He understood that 2 of those options were essentially the same option. He understood what the third option had produced for Mira Sold and what it had produced for her career and what it had produced for her continued existence in any record he could access. He underlined his decision in the private file twice. He was not going to speak with Aldrich Fenn directly. On day 51 the forest made a sound Cael had no framework for. Not new. He had been aware of the ambient pressure at the settlement's northern boundary since his first night in Greyward. The particular quality that the boreal forest produced in darkness. Not quite sound. Not quite silence. A frequency below the threshold of ordinary hearing that registered in the chest rather than the ear. A vibration more than a noise. The specific physical sensation of something very large holding very still at the edge of the settlement's light. The long-term residents had stopped remarking on it. That normalization was its own kind of data, and he had been logging it as such since week 1. On the night of day 51 the quality changed. Not louder. He was precise about this because the precision mattered. Not louder and not closer in any geographical sense. The forest's boundary was fixed, the structures of the settlement unchanged, The physical distance between the treeline and his workspace window exactly what it had been on day one. Closer in a different sense. As though whatever produced the pressure had shifted from ambient to directed. From general to specific. From the undifferentiated attention of something vast and patient holding itself still in the dark, to something focused. Something oriented. Something that had decided, on the night of day 51, to pay attention to a particular point within the settlement. He lay in his bunk and he understood, with the cold clarity that the data had been building toward for 51 days, that the point was his workspace. Whatever was in the forest knew where he kept his documentation. He did not move. He lay still and he counted his own heartbeat, 44 beats per minute, the resting rate of a highly conditioned endurance athlete, which he was not, which was its own data point he did not examine immediately because there was only so much a person could examine simultaneously. And he thought about temperature readings and archival photographs and a researcher whose professional record ended at a clean edge and 4 words written 9 days after a sentence that broke off before it finished. He thought about what it meant that the forest's quality had changed on the same night he had completed the timeline. The same night he had written the line about the names being operational covers. The same night he had finally put into language the thing he had been building toward since day 3. He thought about whether it had been waiting for him to finish. Whether the attention he was feeling in his chest was the attention of something that had been monitoring the progress of his documentation and had registered, on the night of day 51, that he had arrived at the complete picture. He lay still and thought about Mira Sold and what she had written 9 days after a conversation that broke off mid-sentence. He thought about 4 words. He thought about clean edges. He thought about the motion sensors that had never once activated on exit or return across 51 nights of door contact log data. At 0347 the pressure changed again. Not gradually. The same switching off quality he had come to recognize from the settlement's night cycles. Present and then not, as though something had been completed. As though whatever had come to the edge of the treeline to pay attention to a specific room had finished paying attention and returned to wherever the forest kept it between the hours of 0347 and the following night. Or had not returned. He could not determine which. He had no sensor that would tell him. He got up. He went to his workspace. He backed his data onto 2 separate drives and hid one inside his field pack. He wrote the cover note for the private file. He put the encrypted file where it could be found by someone who was already looking. Then he sat at his desk and looked at the window and the darkness beyond it and thought about what the remaining month looked like now. He understood that the picture being complete did not change what the remaining month required of him. He still had work. He was still a researcher. The work did not stop because the data had gone somewhere he had not expected to go and because something in the forest had spent the night of day 51 paying specific attention to the room where he kept it. He opened his official field log. He wrote the day 52 header. He began the new entry. The communal meal before a researcher's departure was something Greyward had formalized into a specific kind of occasion. Not a celebration. Not quite a farewell. A gathering that acknowledged the transition. The whole settlement present, food prepared specifically for the occasion, the warmth of people who had spent a long time in close quarters and found the terms of their coexistence. Cael had attended 11 months of communal meals by the time his departure meal arrived. He knew the settlement's rhythms completely. He knew who would sit where and who would speak first and what the room would look and sound like at every point in the evening. He knew which seat Aldrich Fenn would choose before he arrived. The gathering assembled around him. He participated in its warmth, the genuine regard of people who had known him for 11 months, the questions about his next placement, the small gifts that were part of the settlement's departure tradition. He accepted them with warmth that was real because it was real. He had known these people for 11 months and the regard was genuine and the leaving was genuine and both things could be true simultaneously. He was also running his full observational attention on a man who was 7 seats away and had not looked at him once since sitting down. The not looking was precise. It had the same quality as everything else Cael had documented across 11 months. Deliberate beneath the surface, calibrated to a level of visibility that had been refined across 4 decades of remote northern settlements. A man who was not thinking about Cael would have glanced over at some point in the natural visual drift of a person at a communal dinner. Eyes moved without agenda across familiar rooms. Aldrich Fenn's eyes maintained a circumscribed territory that excluded Cael's position with a precision that was its own kind of attention. Cael ate. He documented. He participated in the conversations that included him. An hour in, a serving bowl moved down the table from the far end, passed hand to hand, moving in Cael's direction. At the moment of transfer, when the bowl arrived in the space directly in front of him, he looked up. Aldrich Fenn was already looking at him. Not from the moment the bowl was passed. From before. Cael understood this immediately, with the certainty of someone who had spent 11 months building the most complete behavioral baseline of his career. The not looking had ended before the bowl reached him, precisely timed, deliberately released, and now there was simply the direct held attention of a man at the far end of a communal table. 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds Cael understood the following with the clarity of pattern that had finally resolved completely. Aldrich Fenn knew about the private file. He knew about the archival photographs and the temperature readings and the sleep pattern data and the motion sensor anomalies and the 4 words written 9 days after a conversation that had broken off mid-sentence. He had known Cael was watching him before Cael had understood that he was watching him. He had been here before. Not in this settlement, not under this name, but in this configuration with a researcher building a file and following the thread to the same place Cael had followed it, and he was still here. Which meant he knew how this ended. Which meant Cael was the variable in this situation who did not yet know. The 2 seconds finished. Aldrich Fenn turned back to the conversation beside him. Smooth. Unhurried. Completely natural. Cael looked at his plate. He drove south at 0630 the following morning. The forest ran alongside the supply road for 30 kilometers before the terrain opened and the ordinary world began reasserting itself. Towns, cleared land, the infrastructure of connected human life that made the 11 months in Greyward feel like a register of existence he was gradually being returned from. He drove without stopping. He had his field pack on the seat beside him and his official documentation in the case behind him and the private file encrypted on the drive hidden inside the pack's inner pocket. He had everything he had arrived with. And one thing he had not arrived with. The complete picture. The full architecture of 11 months of documentation, finally visible in its entirety now that he had the distance to see it whole. He thought about the 2 seconds. He thought about the picture being complete and whether complete was the right word. At 60 kilometers south of Greyward, in the cleared land where the trees had finally given way to open country, he reached into his field pack for his water bottle. His hand found the field thermometer first. He did not know why he took it out. He could not have professionally justified the impulse. He had not planned it. He did not examine it because examining it would have required him to articulate something he was not yet ready to articulate. He held the thermometer against his wrist for the required interval. He looked at the reading. He sat with it. 36.8. Not 34.1. Not the temperature of something sitting in a vehicle at 7 degrees ambient with no behavioral indicators of cold. Not wrong in any way that his framework had a category for. A healthy adult male. Normal range. Exactly what the number should have been. He checked his equipment log. Last calibration 3 days prior. No reported faults. Full function confirmed. 36.8. He sat in the vehicle on the cleared road with the thermometer in his hand and the forest behind him and the ordinary world ahead of him, and he thought about Aldrich Fenn's temperature readings across 11 months of careful controlled measurement. He thought about the archival photographs. He thought about the clean edges at the ends of the names. He thought about Mira sold in 4 words and a career ending without trace. He thought about 2 seconds of held eye contact at a communal table and the specific understanding that had arrived in those 2 seconds, that Aldrich Fenn knew how this ended. He thought about 36.8. He thought about whether the number being normal was the most frightening thing he had documented across 11 months, or whether it was simply the most recent frightening thing in a sequence that had been building since day 3 when a different number had appeared on this same thermometer and he had written it in his field log and told himself it was data. It was data. It was also something else. And he had known that since day 3. And he had spent 11 months building the language for what that something else was and had left the language encrypted in a file in a room in a settlement 60 kilometers north of where he was sitting. He looked at the road ahead. He looked at the mirror. The forest was still there at the horizon. Dark. Exactly where he had left it. The same quality of presence it had maintained across 11 months. The same patience. The same attention that had nothing to do with waiting, because waiting implied that something had not yet happened. Something had already happened. Had been happening. Since day 3. Since the moment he had written 34.1 in his field log and noticed Aldrich Fenn watching him record it with the ease of someone watching a process they had watched before. Since before that. The picture was not complete. The picture had never been complete. What he had been building for 11 months was not a complete picture. It was the visible portion of something that extended in directions he had not yet had the access or the time or the particular kind of courage that looking directly at a thing required. He put the thermometer in his field pack. He looked at the road ahead for a long time. Then he looked at the mirror. The forest at the horizon. Dark. Patient. Already finished with whatever it had started when a researcher arrived in Greyward 11 months ago and noticed a man at a communal dinner and wrote 2 words in his field log without fully understanding what he was writing. Peripheral integration. Observe. He had observed. The engine ran. The road was clear in both directions. The cleared land around him was flat and ordinary and completely indifferent to the decision he was not making. He sat with the thermometer in his field pack and the encrypted file 60 kilometers north and the mirror showing him the forest and the number 36.8 that should have been reassuring and was not. He understood, sitting with all of it, that the thread had not ended when he left Greyward. The thread did not end. It had never ended for anyone who had followed it this far. He looked at the road ahead. He looked at the mirror. He did not reach for the gear shift immediately. He sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine running and the forest in the mirror and 36.8 on a thermometer that had never been wrong before, and he understood that the picture being complete was not what he had thought it meant. Complete meant finished. The change was already finished. It just had not finished with him yet. If you made it this far, you already know what Scar Howl is. Hit subscribe and leave a like so the algorithm keeps bringing you back here. The forest remembers everyone who listens. It will remember you.